Where do ideas come from? I don't really know. It doesn't matter. They arrive. I grew up in a beautiful place. We lived there because my dad really wanted a seaplane. He built one, well, just a regular plane, in 1931 in his backyard in the Bronx. When we moved to Setauket, he tied this seaplane to an apple tree, and we used to use the channel as a runway. There were no boats. It was a really beautiful place to grow up. My dad worked on the lunar excursion module in the capacity of quality control. It was the highlight of his career as an aviator. It was very exciting. Before we moved to Setauket, we lived in Farmingdale. My grandparents lived nearby, aunts and uncles. It was really a very nice little community. My sister was amazing. I couldn't believe how she was able to exist in the world in such a capacity. I was always amazed. Our parents used their hands all the time. They made things, they remade things, they created things. They made our lives amazingly wonderful. But I learned at an early age that it was part of my creative life, and my joy in life was to be able to use my hands and make what I wanted to make. It was really, really wonderful. As a child, I thought I wanted to be a ballet dancer, but that's not true. Really, all I wanted to do was make things. And I did. I made things out of nothing, out of wax, out of the top of a milk carton in first grade that my mother saved, along with this red crepe paper guy. He did have an armature. I used pipe cleaners and yarn and India ink and crepe paper and anything that was nearby. When I was older, I met Pat Windrow, who was an amazingly wonderful artist and very inspiring. She was my mentor. Then I went to college. Oh boy. 17 years old and away from home. It was a whole new world. I met this man very briefly who looked at what I was doing and told me to make dolls. He handed me some Mexican cotton, and well, I did that. I made many, many dolls. I even had an independent study in a painting class. I left school, so I failed that. It was in making dolls. But I continued making dolls for probably 35 years, maybe more. The first dolls were quite crude, but I was experimenting. Every doll was an experiment. Everything was new and exciting, and I was learning how to make things stronger. Mostly, if they didn't have their own legs, they'd fall over. So little by little, I learned how to make strong armatures and how to balance things and keep things from being completely floppy. And I met Barbara Remington, and she took my first dolls. Her posters were in every dorm room in college. But she was such a good friend, a lifelong friend. So many people are such influences. These were some of the first dolls that she sold in her store that she had. She was such a wonderful artist. She was an illustrator and a painter and had so many stories. After the Boggle Shop, I met Julie Schaffler, now Julie Schaffler Dale, and sold mostly all of my dolls out of her gallery for probably 10 or 15 years. It was so exciting. There were mostly wearables that were one-of-a-kind creations there. They were beautiful and inspiring. And it was fun to go there. I just lived right around the corner. So I would gather up my artwork and bring it in, and a couple days later, sometimes I'd get a call, oh, that's sold. As I was making more things, I would bring more in, and that's how I made my living. I didn't know that it was art. I just was making a living. So it developed over time. Living in New York was really very exciting. In the 1980s, I worked as a painter's model for a while. I went to the Art Students League and swept up in order to take classes. I was painting and making dolls to support myself while I was painting. When I met Andy, it was very dramatically different life. Suddenly I was focused slightly differently. It was great. He was a fine human being and still is. We lived in a tiny apartment. He would go to work at 7 in the morning. He worked as a boat builder before he became New York, New Jersey baykeeper. And he would get home at 7 because you could park then. We had a house in Keyport where his office was. So it made it a little bit less time-consuming for commuting. And I continued painting. Keyport was a great town filled with creative people that were so interesting. They're still friends, and I miss them every day. And I kept making things, and things got more complicated and more compound, I guess. And when Andy came along, he had a 6-year-old daughter. That was the best gift ever. I am so lucky. I never had my own children, so being able to enjoy and learn about Emily was about the highlight of my life. And now we have grandchildren. And I can't tell you how much fun that is. And they're growing, and every day we see them, they're different, and they're so full of life. They are endlessly pleasant. So time went by, and Andy, who is also a photographer and a sculptor and a woodworker, and we did some collaborations together. And now we live here. We live here in Rosendale. We bought a house and renovated it and made it comfortable for both of us. We have our own studios, and we're surrounded by the artwork of people whose creations we love. This is a great place to live. Rosendale is a vital town. It's full of people and community who are interested in making a sustainable, creative life in the community. I love it here. I love waking up in the morning. It's always different. There are birds everywhere and all kinds of creatures, and it's really a calm and lovely place to try not to think about what's going on in the world. And there's a lot to learn. I learning about mushrooms and about plants and how things grow, and there's so much to look at. There's so much beauty. I forgot that everywhere I look, there's beauty. It's a great balance. So the tools that I use in my work are pretty simple. Wire cutters, wire, needles, threads, paint, acrylic paint. This was actually the first doll that I ever had that was shown in a museum gallery in a group show. the boxer. And after that, I began to think, well, maybe it's not just making a living. Maybe I'm making art. I put that aside, though, because really I did need to make a living. So I kept making things, making dolls. And it was fun to create because I was telling myself stories all the time and creating the stories. And it made me laugh. So I was amusing myself as well as being able to create. And I maybe was amusing other people too. I don't really know. I did make a lot of dogs. This is my sister's dog, Hasson. I made a mini Hasson for her. She lost her dog. He was the center of her heart for a while. Sometimes you get to redo things. Oh, I got to redo the pants and shoes on this doll, and when it was remade, it was much better. Sometimes I would make a little book and put it in the base of one of the dolls. This one was some dogs I have known and loved. And each page had a portrait of the particular dog and a little story in words and pictures. I think I made about 4 pieces that had books in their base. I didn't know that they were really illustrations of the books or the books themselves. But here is a description, overview, of how I made this dog. It's all made of cloth and it begins with wires. And basically, I begin by drawing with wires. I am making a 3-dimensional grid out of wire and covering it with a kind of batting that's very, very fine and stitching the batting together to make kind of a felted mat. And you'll see the armature really gives structure, and once the matting gets added a little at a time, I'm using all different colored threads so you can see how it's stuck together. Basically, that's all it is, stuck together. You don't see the threads at the end, so it doesn't matter. I like to make eyes out of pantyhose and batting, but you can make eyes out of anything. Little by little, the piece starts taking on a shape and gives me an idea of what it's going to look like. I had to add an extension of the lower jaw on this, but it's easy to add on and subtract before the piece gets finished. I like to make armatures for almost everything. It gives a crispness to the shape that will eventually be stitched and highlighted, indented, sculpted with thread. I use batting, poly-bonded batting that can be stretched pretty fine. And this is an armature for a tongue. I stitched on some batting. I will stitch on some silk thread. I use a lot of pins because it's easier to get an idea of what something looks like. I'm always testing and looking to see what the expression is starting to look like in the piece that I'm making. It's really a lot like playing, like when you're a 5-year-old and you're making up a story in your head and you're playing with your toys and they're sort of speaking to you in their own way. And creating a figure for me is really like playing with my toys. This is a tooth armature that eventually will be covered with batting and with pantyhose and painted with glue and then painted with paint. eyeballs. I use an armature for the eyelid so that the expression of the eye can be adjusted. And I like to use a pin for a highlight. So having a pantyhose eye enables me to be able to stick a pin in, but you should always stick a pin in, but think a good thought. That's just my own personal philosophy when it comes to pins. And I add fabric. This is velour. And it almost doesn't matter what color it is because eventually I will paint it in order to smooth it so that it becomes a unified surface, or a surface that looks sort of rational. And the dog is starting to have some expression. A lot of expression. And you can see I use lots of references so that I can see what an actual dog looks like. I don't have to carry those images in my head and try and find them when I need them. But really the best part for me is painting the piece when it's practically done. I had to put a finer piece of cloth on that ear. First one was too fat. Well, that's about the whole process in a kind of a nutshell. I feel like I've had lots of different lives. One of my favorite parts of a creative career was meeting Neil Zuckerman and selling work out of CFM Gallery. Neil and Tom were so encouraging and so kind, and were there so much for me, and the setting was magnificent. The gallery was so beautiful. Oh, I made things. This particular kitty is in the library in Kansas. So it was a story that I wrote during the hallway interludes that I had during jury duty in New York before I had to go into the juror's room. And it was a lot easier than carrying needles and pins and scissors and threads, and I don't even think you could do that in jury duty in New York at that time, but it was really fun to bring my little pen and paper and write a story. Afterwards, I decided that I wanted to create the characters that were in the story, so I did. This is humor. The Ratavarius that cat was playing. And this is humor. I woke up with this silly image in my head of the Wicked Witch of the West who turned into Dorothy with the help of her plastic sturgeon. Well, it made me laugh, so I made the piece. That was really, really fun. It's all cloth. This is another piece that has a story in its base. Orange Julius. This is Orange Julius. He appeared in so many pieces. He belonged to a friend of mine who passed away, and I took Orange Julius, and he became my muse. He appeared in lots of paintings and drawings. He was a great cat. Have you ever seen mangroves, how they seem to walk through the water? So Julie, in the 1980s, 1984, had a themed show. Mostly she sold wearable, one-of-a-kind garments, which were extraordinary. And I made about 4 or 5 of them. And sometimes I wanted them to look like old newspapers, and sometimes I wanted them to look like an archaeological dig, but they were really fun to create. And 2 of them will be in the permanent collection of the Philadelphia Museum. This doll was one of the dolls that I sold during a NIADA conference. NIADA is the most creative combination of human beings that I think I've ever met. They're extraordinary, kind, helpful. It's wonderful to be part of that organization. I continued painting and I took different jobs. This was a 1980 Playboy illustration, and there were 40 illustrations for The Secret, which was a treasure hunt that I think I started in 1981. The maitre demon. He was one of the characters. And I kept painting and kept making. Thumbelina, I think in 1969 she chose the toad, although it wasn't done in 1969. And then the chairs became much more involved. These have lots of plastic animals attached to it, and it was really fun to start creating the bases that the structures became the structures that the characters would sit on. You have Albert Einstein and the monkey Lisa, and stitched onto the canvas behind the figures is a picture of my cousins and me. So Lisa and Albert discuss the theory of relatives in the atomic age, and these are my relatives. All kinds of dolls came out. This is a siren. They wound up all over the world, like this one. It resides in Italy. I think this one is in Great Britain. This one, I think, got taken apart and became 3 different dolls. Here you have a polymer clay pig sitting on a cloth chair, dreaming of the forest. So one of the highlights of my painting career was having this exhibit at the Spanierman Gallery in New York in 2008. It was so exciting. I sold 3/4 of the pieces the night of the opening. I think I was so blown away by it that I wasn't able to lift a paintbrush for 10 years, but that's okay. Nobody's perfect. But I did have a lot of paintings in there, and they took about 5 years to get all together. And a lot of times they were peopled by people that I sort of knew, or things that were going on in my life. Or you can't tell, but this twig on the right-hand side is actually my dad. This was a letter to my mother. You can see how deer appear and disappear in the woods, and that happens here where I am living now. They tend to disappear in a moment. This is the last painting that I've done fairly recently during our seclusion during COVID. And I was stuck happily in the house for a year and a half, just being able to create with no interruptions. There's Cerberus, this adorable 3-headed dog with Charon, maybe in the river Styx. And these toys that I've had ever since I was really little have appeared in many, many artworks. Me and my sister, I don't know. I don't know if everything is a self-portrait in art, but it's certainly self-involved. And that's it.